On the night the Titanic sank, one house outside Philadelphia burned with light. Lynwood Hall stood awake, every chandelier lit, every corridor open, as Peter Widener waited for his son and grandson to return with $50 million in European art. The clocks passed midnight, then dawn, then silence. When the telegram arrived, it did not just announce 2 deaths. It sealed the future of a dynasty inside 110 empty rooms. Peter Widener did not sell the house. He did not leave it. He stayed, walking halls built for heirs who would never return. But what kind of home survives its own purpose? The man who would not be forgotten. Peter Widener did not build a mansion to live in it. He built it to outlast death itself. He understood something most men of wealth refuse to acknowledge. Money vanished. Companies collapsed. Even empires crumbled into footnotes. But stone endured. Art endured. A house built large enough and beautiful enough could force the future to remember your name long after your children forgot your face. Widener was born in 1834 to a Philadelphia butcher family with nothing but ambition. He started as a cashier. Then he noticed something no one else did. The city was expanding faster than people could walk. Whoever controlled how citizens moved would control the city itself. He bought his first streetcar line in 1873 during a financial panic when others were selling. He bought the next 6 before anyone realized what he was building. By 1880, Peter Widener did not just own Philadelphia's transportation. He owned the routes workers took to factories, the paths shoppers walked to markets, the rhythm of an entire city's day. But streetcars were only the beginning. He moved into utilities, gas lines, electric power, then steel, then railroads that connected Philadelphia to New York, Baltimore, and Chicago. Every investment multiplied. Every partnership placed him closer to men who shaped national policy. By 1900, Peter Widener was one of the 10 wealthiest men in America, worth roughly $70 million in an era when that sum was almost incomprehensible. He collected art the way other men collected properties: Rembrandts, Raphaels, Vermeer. Each painting was not decoration. It was proof that he belonged in the same sentence as the Medicis, the Rothschilds, the names that survived centuries. His collection eventually numbered over 300 pieces, in each selected not for beauty alone, but for its ability to communicate permanence. Yet Widener understood that art needed architecture. A Rembrandt hung in a townhouse was just expensive wallpaper. A Rembrandt displayed in a palace became evidence of dynasty. So in 1997, at age 63, Peter Widener purchased 300 acres of rolling Pennsylvania farmland 12 miles north of Philadelphia. The location was deliberate, close enough to the city to demonstrate power, far enough to create its own world. He hired Horace Trumbauer, the most expensive architect in America, and gave him a single instruction: build something that cannot be ignored. Trumbauer delivered Lynwood Hall. The scale was absurd even by Gilded Age standards. 110 rooms spread across 70,000 square feet. Imported French limestone for the exterior walls. Marble staircases modeled after Versailles. Ballrooms designed to host 200 guests. Libraries paneled in oak from trees older than the Republic. 14 bathrooms with fixtures cast in bronze. A pipe organ built into the walls. An art gallery with skylights engineered to showcase paintings under perfect natural light. Construction took 3 years and cost over $8 million. Adjusted for inflation, That equals roughly 250 million in modern currency. The house consumed money the way a foundry consumed coal, but Widener was not building a home. He was building insurance against oblivion. Every room declared that Peter Widener existed, that he mattered, that his wealth had transformed into something death could not erase. He moved his family into Lynwood Hall in 1900. His wife Hannah, his son George, his daughter Eleanor, staff numbering 43 people maintained the house daily. Gardeners kept 35 acres of formal gardens perfect. Groomsmen tended the stables. Cooks operated kitchens large enough to serve state dinners. The mansion was ready. The dynasty was ready. All that remained was ensuring it would continue forever. That required heirs. George Widener, Peter's only son, married well. Eleanor Elkins came from another powerful Philadelphia family. Together, they had 3 children. Harry, the eldest, showed particular promise. Intelligent, charismatic, interested in books and art rather than just money. Peter saw in Harry the perfect continuation. A grandson who would not just inherit wealth, but understand its responsibility. By 1912, the plan seemed flawless. 3 generations under one roof. Enough money to maintain Lynwood Hall for centuries. An art collection that museums envied. Peter Widener had successfully built a legacy machine. He did not realize the machine had a single point of failure. And that point of failure was already boarding a ship in Southampton, England. A palace built against time. Every room at Lynwood Hall was designed to prove that decay could be delayed with enough money. The central staircase alone required 16 months to complete. Craftsmen carved each baluster by hand from Italian Carrara marble, the same stone Michelangelo used for his sculptures. The steps were engineered to rise at a specific angle that made descending feel effortless, theatrical, designed for grand entrances where guests could watch their hosts glide down as if gravity itself had been negotiated away. The ballroom stretched 80 feet long, with ceilings that climbed 24 feet high. Chandeliers imported from Paris weighed over 800 pounds each and required a full day to clean. The floor was inlaid parquet oak in a pattern so intricate that walking across it felt like trespassing on art. During parties, orchestras played from a balcony built specifically to project music downward without overwhelming conversation. 14 bedrooms occupied the second floor, each with its own bathroom at a time when indoor plumbing was still considered a luxury. The master suite spanned 3 rooms, connected by pocket doors that disappeared into walls thick enough to muffle sound completely. Peter and Hannah could host weekend parties for 20 families and never hear noise from adjacent guest quarters. The library held 10,000 volumes behind glass cases built floor to ceiling. Sliding ladders on brass rails allowed access to upper shelves. First editions, rare manuscripts, books in Latin, French, and German that Peter could not read but insisted on owning because collectors he respected owned similar volumes. Knowledge as decoration, learning as status symbol. But the true heart of Lynwood Hall was the art gallery. Trumbauer designed it as a freestanding wing connected to the main house by a covered walkway. Skylights filtered northern light through frosted glass to eliminate glare. The walls were covered in silk damask, the color of old wine. Yet temperature control systems maintained constant 68 degrees to prevent paint cracking. Humidity sensors triggered alerts if moisture levels shifted. Here hung the Rembrandts, the Raphaels, the Vermeer. 3 centuries of European mastery arranged in careful sequence to demonstrate not just wealth, but taste. museum curators visited Lynwood Hall to study pieces they could never afford to acquire. Peter Widener opened the gallery to art students and scholars because exclusivity meant nothing if no one knew what you possessed. The contradiction was obvious to anyone paying attention. Lynwood Hall was built for a family of 5: Peter and Hannah, George and Eleanor, their 3 children. 7 people occupied 110 rooms. Most bedrooms stayed empty. Most bathrooms went unused. Entire wings remained closed during winter because heating them cost more than most families earned in a year. The 3rd floor servants' quarters could house 20 staff members, but even with 43 employees, half the rooms stayed vacant. The formal gardens required 6 full-time gardeners. 35 acres of geometric hedges, rose beds, fountains, and crushed stone pathways that existed solely to be viewed from windows. No one picnicked there. No children played tag across the lawns. The gardens were another gallery, living art meant to demonstrate that nature itself could be controlled with sufficient money. The stables held 12 horses, but rarely more than 4 at any time. The carriage house could store 6 vehicles, but usually held 2. The greenhouse grew orchids that bloomed once annually and died if temperature dropped below 55 degrees. The wine cellar descended 2 levels underground and maintained inventory for parties Peter rarely hosted. Every excess created new maintenance demands. Stone facades required cleaning every 3 years to prevent weathering. Copper gutters needed inspection after every storm. Window glass, imported from Belgium in panes larger than standard American sizes, could only be replaced through special order. The pipe organ required a specialist tuner who traveled from New York twice yearly. Staff costs alone exceeded $50,000 annually. In 1900, that was more than most industrial workers earned in a lifetime. Housekeepers, cooks, laundresses, footmen, valets, maids, gardeners, groomsmen. A night watchman who walked the perimeter hourly because a house this large could not be left unguarded. The monthly coal bill during winter reached $800. 12 fireplaces burned simultaneously to keep main rooms comfortable. Bedrooms stayed cold unless occupied. Hallways developed drafts that no amount of weather stripping could eliminate because the building was simply too large to seal completely. Yet Peter Widener never questioned the expense. For him, Lynwood Hall was not a cost. It was an investment. Every dollar spent maintained the structure that would carry his name forward. The house was his monument, his museum, his declaration that he had ascended from butcher's son to American aristocrat. But monuments require occupants. Museums need visitors. Declarations become meaningless without an audience. And by 1912, George and Eleanor had moved into their own Philadelphia townhouse, visiting Lynwood Hall primarily for holidays. The grandchildren were being raised elsewhere. Peter and Hannah increasingly occupied the mansion alone, 2 people in 110 rooms, surrounded by staff who maintained spaces no one entered. The house was waiting for the dynasty it was built to contain, waiting for the generations that would justify its scale, waiting for Harry to inherit and continue the legacy with his own children. Peter believed that day was coming. He believed George and Harry's trip to Europe in the spring of 1912 would be the final piece. They were traveling to purchase additional artworks, including a rare Vermeer and several Rembrandts, to complete the gallery. The acquisitions would cost roughly $1.5 million, but Peter approved the expense without hesitation. When the collection returned, Lynwood Hall would be finished. Perfect. ready to pass to the next generation as a completed masterwork. George and Harry booked return passage on the finest ship afloat, the one vessel that matched Lynwood Hall's ambition, the ship everyone called unsinkable. They chose the Titanic. The voyage meant to seal immortality. The art shipment aboard the Titanic was supposed to finish the Widener legacy, not end it. George Widener was 49 years old in April 1912. He had spent 6 weeks in Paris and London, attending auctions, meeting private collectors, negotiating prices on paintings his father wanted for Lynwood Hall. His son Harry, 27, accompanied him. The trip was equal parts business and education. George handling transactions while teaching Harry the art of acquisition. They purchased brilliantly. A Vermeer cityscape valued at $300,000, 2 Rembrandts, several Dutch masters, a collection of rare manuscripts. The total exceeded $1.5 million, roughly $45 million in modern currency. The artworks were crated, insured, and loaded onto RMS Titanic in Southampton for the journey home. Eleanor Widener, George's wife, traveled with them. She had spent the European trip shopping while her husband and son focused on art. The family booked 3 first-class suites on B deck, among the most expensive accommodations on the ship. Suites B51, B52, and B53 cost $4,350 for the crossing. That was more than most Americans earned in 3 years. Titanic departed Southampton on April 10, 1912. The ship was everything its reputation promised. 882 feet long, 46,000 tons, 16 watertight compartments designed to keep the vessel afloat even if 4 were breached. The grand staircase descended through 6 decks under a glass dome that flooded the interior with natural light. First-class dining rooms served 11 course meals on china, designed specifically for White Star Line. The Wideners settled into luxury they considered ordinary. They were accustomed to Lynwood Hall. A ship, no matter how grand, was simply a floating hotel. George spent afternoons in the smoking room discussing business with other industrialists. Then Harry explored the library and wrote letters to friends describing the voyage. Eleanor took tea in the Palm Court and attended shipboard social events. On the evening of April 14th, Captain Edward Smith hosted a dinner party in the first-class dining saloon honoring the Wideners. It was a recognition of their status. 50 guests attended. The menu included oysters, filet mignon, lamb with mint sauce, roasted squab, and chocolate eclairs. Wine flowed from bottles older than most passengers. George Widener was in excellent spirits. The art purchases had gone perfectly. The voyage was uneventful. They would dock in New York on April 17th, transfer the paintings to secure transport, and be home at Lynwood Hall within days. Peter would be pleased. The gallery would be complete. The Dynasty would continue exactly as planned. The dinner ended around 10:30 in the evening. Guests retired to their staterooms or the smoking lounge. Harry Widener went to his cabin and, according to later accounts from Eleanor, spent time arranging his recent book purchases. He had bought a rare 1821 edition of Francis Bacon's essays in London and was excited to show it to his grandfather. The book was small enough to fit in his pocket. George and Eleanor prepared for bed. The ship was calm. The sea was smooth. The temperature had dropped noticeably, but inside their heated suite, it hardly mattered. At 11:40 p.m., Titanic struck an iceberg on its starboard side. Most passengers barely noticed. The collision felt like a shudder, a scraping sensation, nothing alarming. George Widener stepped into the corridor to investigate, but saw no panic, no crew rushing, and no indication of danger. He returned to the suite and told Eleanor it was likely nothing serious. But within 20 minutes, stewards were knocking on doors, instructing passengers to put on life jackets and proceed to the boat deck. The orders were calm, almost casual, precautionary measures, nothing to worry about. The ship was unsinkable. George, Eleanor, and Harry dressed in their warmest coats and made their way to the deck. The scene was surreal. Passengers in evening gowns and tuxedos milling about, treating the evacuation like an inconvenience rather than an emergency. The lifeboats were being loaded, women and children first, but many refused to board. The boats looked flimsy. The ship looked solid. Eleanor Widener was placed in lifeboat number 4 around 1:40 a.m. She begged George and Harry to join her, but officers refused. Men were not being loaded unless boats had empty seats. George assured his wife it was fine. The ship was not sinking. They would board another boat, or stay on Titanic until rescue arrived. This was simply procedure. Harry stood beside his father, hands in his coat pockets. He had brought the bacon book with him, a reflex. If he was going to wait on a cold deck for hours, at least he would have something to read. Lifeboat 4 was lowered into the Atlantic at 1:55 a.m. Eleanor watched the ship recede. She could still see figures on deck. She convinced herself George and Harry were finding another boat, that they would all reunite on the rescue ship in the morning. Titanic sank at 2:20 a.m. Of the 2,224 people aboard, only 706 survived. George Widener was not among them. Neither was Harry. Their bodies were never recovered. The bacon book was never found. The $1.5 million in art crated in the cargo hold went down with the ship. The Vermeer, the Rembrandts, the manuscripts, everything George and Harry had spent 6 weeks acquiring. Every piece meant to complete the gallery at Lynwood Hall. Eleanor survived. She was pulled aboard the Carpathia, the rescue ship that arrived 90 minutes too late. She spent 4 days in shock, wrapped in blankets, unable to speak coherently about what had happened. When the Carpathia docked in New York on April 18th, Peter Widener was waiting at the pier. She was the only one who came home. Peter returned to Lynwood Hall with his daughter-in-law and 2 telegrams. One confirmed George's death. One confirmed Harry's. The dynasty he had built across 50 years, the legacy he had constructed room by room and painting by painting, ended in 2.5 hours in the North Atlantic. The house was still standing. The gallery was still waiting. The 110 rooms were still perfect, but they were empty in a way that could never be filled. Lynwood Hall had been built to contain generations. Now it would contain only grief. When news crossed the Atlantic, the telegram arrived quietly, but it shattered every future Lynwood Hall was built to contain. Peter Widener received the first message on April 15th, while the Carpathia was still racing toward the Titanic's last known coordinates. The text was brief. Titanic struck iceberg, sinking, fate of passengers unknown. He sent immediate replies demanding information, contacting White Star Line officials, calling every connection he had in the shipping industry. No one could tell him anything certain. The wireless reports were fragmentary. Some messages claimed all passengers were safe. Others mentioned lifeboats in the water. By evening, the truth was undeniable. Titanic had gone down. Hundreds were dead. Survivor lists were incomplete. George Widener's name did not appear on any survivor list. Neither did Harry's. Eleanor's name appeared twice, once incorrectly spelled, creating momentary confusion before confirmation arrived that she had been rescued. Peter waited. He was 78 years old and had spent his entire life solving problems with money, influence, and control. But this problem existed beyond his reach. His son and grandson were either alive on a lifeboat drifting in the Atlantic, or they were dead in water, cold enough to kill within minutes. He could do nothing but wait for a ship that was sailing too slowly. Hannah, his wife of 47 years, collapsed when the confirmed death toll began circulating. Their family doctor was summoned to Lynwood Hall and remained for 3 days, sedating her through the worst of the shock. Peter did not collapse. He became silent. He moved through the mansion, giving instructions to staff, preparing rooms for Eleanor's return, arranging for privacy and security when she arrived. But the silence around him was not calm. It was the silence of a man whose internal architecture had cracked and was now trying to prevent total collapse by refusing to acknowledge the damage. The Carpathia docked in New York on April 18th. Peter traveled by private rail car, arriving at the pier hours before the ship. He waited in a closed carriage while crowds of reporters and families pressed against police barriers. When Eleanor finally disembarked, assisted by Red Cross volunteers, Peter brought her directly to the rail car without speaking to press. The journey back to Philadelphia took 4 hours. Eleanor barely spoke. When she did, it was in fragments. The cold, the lifeboats, Harry's coat, George telling her not to worry, the sound of the ship breaking apart. She could not construct a linear narrative. Trauma had shattered sequence into images that replayed without order. Peter asked only one question during the entire trip. Did they suffer? Eleanor said she did not think so. It happened too fast. The water was too cold. They would have lost consciousness quickly. It was a merciful lie. Peter accepted it because the alternative was unthinkable. They arrived at Lynwood Hall after dark. The staff had lit every lamp in the house, a gesture meant to provide warmth and welcome. Instead, the mansion looked like a stage set. Bright, empty, performing normalcy for an audience that no longer existed. Eleanor was taken to a guest suite. Hannah remained sedated in the master bedroom. Peter walked the first floor alone, moving from room to room without purpose. He entered the art gallery and stood before the empty wall spaces where the new acquisitions were supposed to hang. The Vermeer would have gone there, the Rembrandts on that wall, the manuscripts in the display case. All of it was gone, not stolen, not destroyed in a fire he could rebuild from. Simply gone, erased as if it had never existed. In $2 men and $1.5 million in art, vanished into the Atlantic in less time than it took to serve dinner. Peter did not cry. He did not rage. He stood in the gallery for over an hour, then returned to his study and closed the door. The funeral arrangements were surreal. There were no bodies to bury. George and Harry had vanished into the ocean, along with over 1,500 other victims whose remains would never be recovered. Peter arranged a memorial service at Holy Trinity Church in Philadelphia. Over 2,000 people attended: business leaders, politicians, society figures who had known the Widener family for decades. They filled the pews. They offered condolences. They spoke about George's business acumen and Harry's promise. Peter sat in the front row beside Hannah and Eleanor, listening to strangers summarize his son and grandson in platitudes. The service ended. The guests departed. Peter returned to Lynwood Hall. And then he did something no one expected. He stopped leaving. In the weeks following the Titanic, Peter had been expected to resume his business affairs. Board meetings, investment decisions, social obligations. He was still one of the wealthiest men in America, still held controlling interests in railroads and utilities, still had responsibilities that required his presence. He ignored all of it. Secretaries arrived at Lynwood Hall with documents requiring signature. Peter signed them without reading. Business partners requested meetings. Peter declined. Invitations arrived for charity events, political dinners, social gatherings he had always attended. He ignored them all. Hannah remained in her bedroom, rarely emerging. Eleanor stayed for several weeks before moving back to her own residence, unable to bear the oppressive silence of the mansion. Peter remained. Staff began to notice changes. He stopped eating in the dining room, taking meals alone in his study. He stopped dressing formally, wearing the same clothes multiple days in a row. He began walking the house at night, pacing corridors for hours, opening doors to empty rooms and standing in doorways as if expecting someone to emerge. The night staff reported hearing footsteps on the second floor when Peter was confirmed to be on the first, doors closing when no one was near them. The sound of someone walking the grand staircase during hours when everyone was asleep. But the house was not haunted. It was occupied by a man who could no longer sleep, who moved through darkness because daylight made the emptiness too obvious, who opened doors hoping irrationally that this time someone would be there. Peter Widener had built Lynwood Hall to defeat death, to create something permanent enough to carry his name beyond his lifetime. But death had won anyway. It had taken his son and grandson and left him alone in a palace designed for generations that would never arrive. The mansion became his prison, not because he could not leave, but because leaving required a reason, and Peter no longer had one. A house that refused to sleep after the Titanic, Lynwood Hall stayed lit, as if darkness itself had become unbearable. The night staff later testified to the same routine. Every evening after sunset, Peter Widener would instruct the housekeepers to light every chandelier, lamp, iron sconce in the mansion, the ballroom, the gallery, the library, guest bedrooms that had not housed visitors in months. Even the third-floor servants' quarters, largely unoccupied, blazed with light. The electric bill for June 1912 exceeded $1,200, triple the normal cost. The utility company sent an inquiry asking if there had been a meter error. Peter ignored it. By August, the monthly electric expense had become one of the largest line items in the household budget, surpassing food, coal, and staff wages. Peter explained his reasoning to no one, but the staff understood. Empty rooms in darkness became voids. Lit rooms remained spaces. As long as light filled the corridors, the house felt inhabited, purposeful, alive. Darkness allowed the mind to populate emptiness with absence, so the lights stayed on, and all of them, all night. Peter's insomnia became total. He stopped going to bed at regular hours. Instead, he would walk. Starting in his study, he would move through the first floor, entering each room, standing for several minutes, then moving to the next. The library, the dining room, the morning room, the conservatory. Each space received his attention as if he were conducting an inspection. Then he would climb the grand staircase to the second floor. The bedrooms. George's former room, untouched since April. Harry's room, where his books still lined the shelves. The guest suites where family had stayed during holidays that now seemed impossibly distant. Peter would open each door, stand in the doorway, then close it and move to the next. The night maids working in shifts to maintain the fires and lamps learned to avoid him. They would hear his footsteps approaching and retreat into service corridors until he passed. Not because he was unkind, but because his presence had become unsettling. He moved through the house like a man searching for something he knew he would not find, but could not stop looking for. Some nights he ended up in the art gallery. He would sit in the leather chair positioned before the main wall and stare at the paintings. 300 works collected over decades. Rembrandts, Raphaels, Vermeers. Not the ones lost on the Titanic, but the ones already hanging. Proof of his success. Evidence of his taste. Monuments to his ability to acquire what others could only admire. But now the paintings felt like witnesses. They had outlasted his son. They would outlast him. The art would survive, be sold, dispersed to museums and private collectors, while his name faded into archival footnotes. Hannah remained largely confined to the second floor. Her grief took a different shape. She wanted the house quiet, dark, sealed. Peter's insistence on keeping every lamp burning felt like denial. She asked him repeatedly to turn off the lights, to let the house rest, to stop wandering at night. He refused. Their marriage did not fracture. It simply became two separate experiences of loss occurring in the same building. Hannah mourned by withdrawing. Peter mourned by refusing to stop moving. By autumn 1912, rumors began circulating among Philadelphia society. Peter Widener had gone mad. He was seeing ghosts. He believed George and Harry were still alive somewhere in the mansion. The stories multiplied with each retelling, becoming more elaborate, more gothic, and more suited to a ghost story than reality. The truth was simpler and sadder. Peter was not insane. He was trapped. Trapped by the house he had built as a guarantee against death. The mansion had fulfilled its purpose. It had survived. It was permanent, enduring, exactly what he had designed it to be. But survival without purpose is not victory. It is torture. The staff reports of paranormal activity increased. Footsteps in empty hallways, doors opening without explanation, the pipe organ playing faint notes when no one was in the music room, cold spots in bedrooms despite functioning radiators, the sound of someone descending the grand staircase during the early morning hours when Peter was confirmed to be in his study. But every unexplained sound had a rational explanation. Lynwood Hall was an enormous structure, 70,000 square feet of wood, stone, and plaster, expanding and contracting with temperature changes. Wind moving through gaps in window frames. Pressure differences between heated and unheated rooms, creating drafts that move doors. The pipe organ responding to humidity shifts in the air bladders. Old houses, especially large ones, generated their own acoustic library of creaks, groans, and whispers. Add to that a staff of over 30 people working in shifts around the clock. Footsteps on the servant stairs echoing through walls, maids closing doors in distant wings, the night watchman making his rounds. Any of those sounds, heard at 3 a.m. by someone already unnerved, could transform into something supernatural. And then there was Peter himself. His nightly walks through the mansion created most of the reported ghost sightings. Maids would swear they heard someone in the East Wing, only to later learn Peter had been there. The sound of pacing in the library. Peter, the figure standing motionless in the gallery doorway. Also Peter. He had become the ghost in his own house, a living man haunting rooms that no longer had use for him. But one incident defied easy explanation. In November 1912, the head housekeeper entered the gallery early one morning to open curtains and air the room. She found every painting slightly askew, not fallen, not damaged, just tilted a few degrees off center, as if someone had walked along the wall adjusting each frame. Peter had not been in the gallery that night. He had stayed in his study until dawn, confirmed by the night butler who had brought him tea at 4 a.m. No staff member had entered the gallery. The doors had been locked. The housekeeper reported it to Peter. He said nothing, walked to the gallery, and spent 20 minutes straightening each painting. Then he locked the door and kept the key. He never explained what he thought had happened. Perhaps he believed nothing had happened. Perhaps he believed something had and preferred not to say. Perhaps the distinction between real and unreal no longer mattered in a house that had become a mausoleum for living grief. Lynwood Hall did not sleep because Peter Widener could not sleep. The house stayed lit because darkness felt like surrender. The rooms stayed open because closing them would admit they were no longer needed. But keeping a house awake requires energy. And energy, and even for the very wealthy, eventually runs out. When wealth could not fix grief, money rebuilt railroads and cities, but it could not give Peter Widener a reason to leave his house. By early 1913, Peter's withdrawal from public life was total. He resigned from every corporate board, declined every social invitation, refused every interview request. Business associates who needed decisions learned to send documents to Lynwood Hall and wait for signed papers to return by courier. His daily routine contracted into ritual. He woke late, often after 10 in the morning, breakfast alone in his study, hours spent reading newspapers, though staff noticed he rarely turned the pages. Lunch brought to him on a tray, afternoons in the library or gallery, sitting motionless for hours. Dinner alone, then the nightly walks through the empty house until dawn. He was 79 years old and worth approximately $70 million. He could have traveled anywhere, built another mansion, remarried after Hannah's death in 1914, started a foundation, donated the art collection to a museum and secured his legacy that way. He did none of it. Wealth had always solved problems for Peter Widener. Want a transportation monopoly? Buy every competitor. Need political influence? Fund campaigns. Want a mansion that proclaims your importance? Hire the best architect and spend whatever it takes. But grief did not respond to money. Loss did not accept payment. The absence of his son and grandson could not be filled by acquisition or construction or any transaction he knew how to execute. So he stopped trying. He stopped doing anything except existing in the house that was supposed to preserve his legacy. The staff watched him diminish. Not physically, though he did lose weight. Emotionally, he became translucent, present but not engaged, responsive but not connected. He would pass servants in hallways without acknowledging them, sit through meals without tasting food, hold conversations where he spoke all the correct words but meant none of them. Eleanor visited occasionally, but the mansion oppressed her. Every room reminded her of George and Harry. Every hallway echoed with voices that were not there. She would stay a few hours, share a mostly silent meal with Peter, then leave. She later told friends that visiting Lynwood Hall felt like visiting a tomb where the occupant was still alive. Peter's daughter, Eleanor Widener Peabody, I tried to convince him to sell the house. It was too large, too expensive, too full of painful memories. He could move into a smaller residence, donate Lynwood Hall to an institution, turn it into a museum. Peter refused. Selling would be surrender. Leaving would be abandonment. The house was the last physical connection to the dynasty he had built. George had walked these halls. Harry had grown up in these rooms. As long as Peter remained, some fragment of them remained too. But that logic trapped him. He could not leave because leaving felt like betrayal, but staying meant living inside a monument to failure. Lynwood Hall had been built to contain generations. Instead, it contained one old man refusing to admit his dream had died. The financial cost of maintaining the mansion became absurd. In 1913, operating expenses exceeded $80,000. That included staff salaries, utilities, maintenance, groundskeeping, and supplies. $80,000 to keep a house running for one person. The heating bill alone reached $15,000 annually. Lynwood Hall's 70,000 square feet required coal deliveries twice weekly during winter. 12 fireplaces burned simultaneously, radiators in every room, heated water for 14 bathrooms. The system was designed for a household of dozens. For Peter alone, it was grotesque excess. But he would not close wings, would not reduce staff, would not scale back anything. Doing so would acknowledge the house had become too large for its purpose. And acknowledging that meant acknowledging everything he had built had been for nothing. So the gardeners maintained 35 acres no one walked through. The stables housed horses no one rode. The kitchens prepared meals for dinner parties that never happened. The ballroom stayed ready for guests who never arrived. Lynwood Hall was performing wealth with no audience. In June 1914, Hannah Widener died at age 77. Her health had declined steadily after the Titanic, the grief compounding existing heart problems. She spent her final months in the master bedroom, rarely leaving, rarely speaking, slowly fading. Peter arranged her funeral at the same church where George and Harry's memorial had been held. Another service, another crowd, another performance of public mourning while private grief continued unobserved. After Hannah's death, Peter was truly alone. His daughter had her own family, though Eleanor had remarried and moved to Washington. The house staff were employees, not companions. He spent evenings in his study or the gallery, surrounded by art and books and furniture, all of it worthless at preventing solitude. The night walks intensified. Staff reported seeing lamplight under Peter's study door at 4 and 5 in the morning. The sound of his footsteps on the marble stairs. Doors opening and closing throughout the night. He was not searching anymore. He was just moving, because stopping meant confronting the fact that he had nowhere to go and no reason to be going there. By 1915, friends who still attempted contact noticed something had broken in Peter's affect. He was not depressed in the way that word usually meant. He was absent. When you spoke to him, he would respond appropriately, but there was no one behind the words. The man who had built an empire through force of will, who had dominated boardrooms and crushed competitors, who had accumulated wealth beyond comprehension, had given up. Not on life. He still woke each day, still ate, still functioned. He had given up on the idea that any of it mattered. Lynwood Hall stood perfect and maintained and utterly pointless. The art collection remained museum quality. The architecture remained flawless. The gardens remained immaculate. But the house had been built to declare that Peter Widener's legacy would survive him. Instead, it had become evidence that survival without purpose is indistinguishable from decay. And Peter, walking its halls night after night, was living proof. A dynasty without heirs. Lynwood Hall was built for generations, but only one aging man remained inside it. The mathematics of dynasty had seemed simple when Peter Widener first planned the estate. 1 son, 3 grandchildren, future great-grandchildren. Each generation would occupy the mansion, add to the art collection, and pass it forward. Wealth would compound. The family name would endure. Lynwood Hall would become synonymous with Widener the way Versailles meant bourbon. But dynasties require biological continuity. And biological continuity, despite all of Peter's wealth and planning, had failed. George was dead. Harry was dead. That left Eleanor, Harry's younger sister, who had married and moved to her husband's family estate, and George's widow, Eleanor Elkins Widener, who had remarried in 1915 to a Harvard professor named Alexander Rice. She moved to Boston, taking with her the last direct connection to George and Harry. Peter had cousins, nephews, a scattered network of extended Widener relations, but none of them were his heirs in the way that mattered. None had been raised in Lynwood Hall. None had been groomed to inherit the empire. They were beneficiaries of his will, not continuations of his dynasty. The distinction mattered deeply. Peter had not spent 50 years building wealth just to scatter it among distant relatives. He had built it to create a lineage, a name that would echo across centuries. But lineages require heirs who care about lineage. And the people who survived Peter did not care about Lynwood Hall the way he did. They saw a house. Peter saw a mission. In 1915, Peter revised his will for the 4th time since the Titanic. Previous versions had designated George as primary heir, with trusts established for Harry and Eleanor's children. Now those provisions were obsolete. George had no children to inherit. Harry had no children. The dynasty ended with Peter. The new will divided the estate among surviving family members and established trusts for charitable causes. A library at Harvard in Harry's name. Donations to hospitals. Provisions for long-term staff. The art collection would be sold and proceeds distributed. Lynwood Hall itself was left to his daughter, Eleanor Widener Peabody, but the will included no restrictions on what she could do with it. Sell it, demolish it, repurpose it. Peter no longer cared. The house had failed its purpose. Preserving it after his death would be her decision, not his legacy. This reading the revised will felt like drafting a surrender document. Peter was admitting that everything he had built would not continue beyond him. The mansion would be sold to strangers or institutions. The art would scatter to museums. The Widener name would appear in history books as a footnote about Gilded Age excess, remembered not for achievement, but for tragedy. He signed the document without ceremony, filed it with his attorneys, then returned to Lynwood Hall and resumed his nightly walks through empty rooms. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent millions building insurance against oblivion. Instead, he had built a monument to the fact that nothing survives. Not families, not fortunes, not even houses designed to last forever. Lynwood Hall had become a paradox. It was the most permanent thing Peter had ever created. Yet it represented the complete failure of permanence to matter. By 1916, the mansion was showing signs of institutional neglect. Not decay exactly. Everything was still maintained. But there was a difference between maintaining a family home and maintaining a museum no one visits. The house remained physically perfect while emotionally abandoned. Rooms that had once hosted dinner parties now collected dust under sheets. The ballroom chandeliers were cleaned quarterly but never lit. The grand staircase, designed for theatrical descents, saw only servants moving between floors. The art gallery remained open, but Peter rarely visited anymore. Looking at the paintings reminded him too sharply of what was supposed to hang there. The Vermeer lost with the Titanic. The Rembrandts George and Harry had selected, and staff turnover increased. Working at Lynwood Hall had once been prestigious. Now it felt like maintaining a mausoleum. The younger servants left for positions in households that felt alive. Replacements were harder to find. By late 1916, the staff had shrunk from 43 to 28, and several of those were part-time. The gardens began their slow fade, not dramatically, just the incremental surrender that happens when scale outpaces purpose. Hedges grew slightly wild, flower beds lost their geometric precision, pathways developed weeds between stones. The head gardener requested additional help. Peter approved the budget, but no one applied for the positions. 35 acres of ornamental gardens required constant labor to remain perfect. Without that labor, nature reasserted itself slowly, patiently, inevitably. Inside the mansion, similar erosion occurred. The third floor, largely unused, was closed entirely to save heating costs. Furniture was covered. Windows were shuttered. Entire wings that had always been ready for guests were now acknowledged as unnecessary. Peter did not order these changes. His household manager made them pragmatically, and Peter did not object. He had stopped caring about maintaining appearances. Lynwood Hall's perfection had been meant to impress visitors and provide for family. With no visitors and no family, perfection became pointless performance. Yet, he would not sell. He would not leave. He remained inside the house, now 82 years old, increasingly frail, still walking at night through corridors that grew darker as lamp bulbs burned out and were not replaced. The tragedy of Peter Widener's final years was not poverty or scandal or dramatic collapse. It was the slow realization that he had won every battle that mattered and lost the only war that did. He had accumulated more wealth than he could spend, built a house that would outlast him, collected art museums envied. But he had not defeated death. He had not secured immortality. He had not guaranteed his name would matter. Lynwood Hall stood as proof. It was still magnificent, still valuable, still architecturally important. But it was no longer a home. It was a building waiting for its purpose to be reassigned by people who never knew what it was originally for. And Peter, walking its halls alone, had become a ghost, haunting his own legacy. Rooms that began to empty one by one, the rooms lost their meaning before they lost their furniture. The process was invisible at first. Nothing was removed, nothing was sold. But meaning drained from spaces the way water leaves a lake during drought. You do not notice the change day by day, but one morning you look and realize the lake is gone. The music room lost its meaning when no one played the piano. The instrument remained, a Steinway grand worth thousands of dollars, but its lid stayed closed. Dust accumulated on the keys. The strings went out of tune. The room became a place where an expensive object was stored, not a place where music happened. The ballroom lost its meaning when Peter stopped hosting. The space remained ready, chandeliers functional, floor polished, but readiness without use is just emptiness with better lighting. By 1917, the ballroom had not seen guests in 5 years. It had become a stage with no audience, performing architecture for no one. The dining room lost its meaning when meals became solitary. The table seated 24. Peter ate alone at one end, served by a footman who stood silently in the corner. The other 23 chairs waited for people who would not arrive. Eventually, the household manager suggested moving Peter's meals to the smaller breakfast room. Peter agreed. The dining room was closed. One by one, the rooms surrendered. Guest bedrooms on the second floor were sheeted over. The conservatory's tropical plants died and were not replaced. The billiard room's table was covered with canvas. The morning room's curtains stayed drawn. The library's books remained on shelves, but no one read them. Peter's own use of the house contracted. By 1917, he occupied only his study, his bedroom, and the path between them. Everything else was maintained out of habit, not necessity. 30 servants keeping 70,000 square feet, ready for a life that had ended 5 years ago. The financial burden had become surreal. In 1917, operating costs reached $90,000. That was more than a successful physician earned in a decade. $90,000 to keep one old man in a house built for 50 people. The heating system alone cost $18,000 annually. 6 coal deliveries per week during winter. Fires in 12 rooms. Radiators throughout the mansion. The system was designed for constant occupancy. For Peter's limited use, it was economic insanity. But reducing operations would mean acknowledging the house had become too large, and Peter could not acknowledge that without acknowledging everything it implied. So the fires burned, the radiators hissed, the coal arrived weekly, and 70,000 square feet stayed warm for one man who rarely left his study. Staff costs had dropped to $32,000 as positions went unfilled. But that still meant 24 people employed to maintain a household of 1. 3 cooks for meals served to a single person. 4 housekeepers for rooms no one entered. 6 gardeners for landscapes no one walked through. The absurdity was obvious to everyone except Peter. Or perhaps it was obvious to him too, and he simply did not care anymore. Caring required energy he no longer possessed. The night walks continued, but shorter now. Peter was 83 in 1918, increasingly unsteady, using a cane to navigate stairs. He no longer climbed to the second floor. His circuit contracted to the first floor rooms, moving from study to library, to gallery to conservatory, then back to study. Each night, the path grew shorter. The stops grew longer. He would stand in doorways, leaning on his cane, looking into darkness. What he saw there, no one knew. Perhaps he saw the rooms as they had been, full of family, alive with purpose. Or perhaps he saw them as they were, empty stages waiting for a play that would never be performed. The staff began preparing for the inevitable. Peter was old. His health was declining. When he died, Lynwood Hall would change hands. His daughter would inherit. She would almost certainly sell. The house would be repurposed, subdivided, or demolished. Several staff members began seeking new positions, not because they were disloyal, because they understood that Lynwood Hall's time as a family residence was ending. When Peter died, the house would die with him. In September 1915, Peter suffered a minor stroke. He recovered, but his left side remained weak. Walking became more difficult. The night circuit stopped entirely. He remained in his study most days, sitting in a leather chair by the window, looking out at gardens he could no longer reach. His daughter visited more frequently. She brought her children, Peter's grandchildren through her marriage to William Peabody. The children were young, energetic, confused by the enormous empty house and the silent old man who barely acknowledged them. They would run through the hallways, their voices echoing off marble and plaster. For a few hours, Lynwood Hall would sound alive. Then they would leave, and the silence would return, heavier than before. Peter's doctor suggested hiring a full-time nurse. Peter refused. He did not want a stranger in his study. He did not need constant care. He was fine. He was not fine. But admitting that meant admitting his body was failing the way everything else had failed. By early 1912, Peter rarely left his chair. Meals were brought to him. He stopped dressing in formal clothes, wearing a robe most days. He stopped reading newspapers, stopped signing documents, stopped pretending any of it mattered. The house continued around him. Staff cleaned rooms he would never enter again. Gardeners maintained landscapes he could no longer see. The heating system warmed spaces he could not reach. Lynwood Hall kept performing its function, but oblivious to the fact that its reason for existing was sitting motionless in a study chair, waiting for nothing in particular. On November 6, 1915, Peter Widener suffered a second, more severe stroke. He died 3 days later without regaining consciousness. He was 81 years old. He died in his study at Lynwood Hall, surrounded by servants, with his daughter at his side. He died inside the house built to preserve his legacy. The house that had survived him. The house that had outlasted his dynasty. The house that proved permanence was possible and completely meaningless. The final walk through the house. Peter Widener died 2 years after the Titanic, inside the house that had already buried him. The actual date was November 9th, 1915. But the man who built Lynwood Hall had died in April 1912 when the telegram arrived from the Titanic. What remained afterward was not Peter Widener, the empire builder, the art collector, the dynasty founder. It was a ghost occupying a house that no longer needed him. His death, when it finally came, felt less like tragedy and more like paperwork being finalized. The stroke happened quickly. He collapsed in his study on November 6th while reading. The household staff summoned his doctor and his daughter. For 3 days, he lay unconscious in his bedroom, while physicians confirmed what everyone already knew. His body was shutting down. Eleanor Peabody sat with her father during those final days. She later told friends that he looked smaller in the massive 4-poster bed, as if the house had been slowly consuming him, and now there was barely anything left. His breathing was shallow. His skin was gray. He never opened his eyes. On November 9th at 4:30 in the morning, Peter's breathing stopped. The doctor confirmed death. Eleanor notified the rest of the family. By sunrise, the news had reached Philadelphia society. Peter Widener, titan of industry, art collector, builder of Lynwood Hall, was dead at 81. The funeral was held at Holy Trinity Church, the same location as George and Harry's memorial 3 years earlier. Over 3,000 people attended: politicians, business leaders, society figures. They filled the church and overflowed into the street. Newspapers ran front-page obituaries praising Peter's business acumen, his philanthropy, his contributions to Philadelphia's development. They called him a self-made man, a visionary, an example of American possibility. They described Lynwood Hall as his greatest achievement, a monument to taste and ambition. None of them mentioned that he died alone in a house built for 50 people. None mentioned the 3 years he spent wandering empty halls, unable to leave, unable to stay, trapped by his own creation. Peter was buried beside Hannah in the family plot. George and Harry, their bodies never recovered from the Atlantic, had a memorial stone but no graves. The 4 names were now together, carved in granite, the physical dynasty reduced to engraved text. Eleanor inherited Lynwood Hall per the will's instructions. She also inherited the problem of what to do with 110 rooms no one wanted. The estate appraisal took 3 months. The art collection alone was valued at $12 million. The house and land were appraised at $1.8 million. Furnishings, fixtures, and personal property added another $500,000. Total estate value approached $70 million, one of the largest in American history at that time. But value and desirability are different things. The art could be sold easily. Museums and collectors would pay top prices for Rembrandts and Raphaels. The house was a different matter. Lynwood Hall had been designed for one specific purpose: to serve as a family dynasty headquarters. That purpose no longer existed. Repurposing a 110-room mansion built around early 20th century assumptions about wealth and service was nearly impossible. Eleanor had no interest in living there. She had her own estate. Her husband's family had their own properties. She had children to raise and a life in Boston. Lynwood Hall represented her father's obsession, not her future. She considered options. Donate it to an institution as a museum, convert it to a school or hospital, subdivide it into apartments, sell it to another wealthy family. Each option had problems. As a museum, it would require an endowment to maintain. Eleanor was not interested in funding perpetual operations. As a school or hospital, the layout was wrong. Too residential, too inefficient, too expensive to heat and maintain. As apartments, the conversion costs would be prohibitive. As a private residence, the market for 110-room estates was vanishingly small. So Eleanor did what many heirs of Gilded Age mansions would do over the next decades, and she sold the art and tried to sell the house. The art sales took 2 years. Auctions in New York and London. Museums negotiating for specific pieces. Private collectors bidding on Rembrandts. The $12 million collection was dispersed across institutions and individuals who would care for it better than it had been cared for in its final years at Lynwood Hall. The house itself sat empty. Staff were dismissed, except for a skeleton crew of caretakers. Furniture was removed or sheeted over. Utilities were reduced to minimum. The mansion entered a state of suspension, maintained enough to prevent decay, but not enough to remain alive. Eleanor listed the property for sale in 1917. The asking price was $800,000 for house, land, and remaining furnishings. There were no offers. She reduced the price to $600,000, then $500,000. Still no offers. The problem was obvious. The Gilded Age was ending. World War I had shifted American attitudes about wealth display. Maintaining a 110-room private residence now seemed obscene rather than impressive. The generation that built estates like Lynwood Hall was dying. The next generation wanted something different, smaller, more practical, less weighted with symbolic meaning. By 1920, Lynwood Hall had been empty for 5 years. The gardens had gone wild. Windows were shuttered. The main entrance was locked and chained. Neighbors reported that at night, from certain angles, the mansion looked like a ship run aground, massive and abandoned, slowly being reclaimed by the landscape. Some reported seeing lights in windows, or hearing music from inside, watching figures move past curtains. Local teenagers dared each other to approach the gates after dark, trading stories about the ghost of Peter Widener still walking his mansion, unable to leave even in death. But there were no ghosts, just an empty house generating its own mythology, because people needed empty houses to mean something. A mansion this large could not be allowed to simply sit vacant. It had to be haunted. It had to contain secrets. Otherwise, it was just a real estate problem no one wanted to solve. Eleanor finally sold Lynwood Hall in 1922. The buyer was Joseph Widener, Peter's nephew. He paid $250,000, less than a third of the original asking price, and roughly 1/10 of what Peter spent building it. Joseph had no intention of living there. He purchased the estate to prevent it from being sold to strangers or demolished. He kept minimal caretaking staff and used the mansion occasionally for storage. Mostly, he let it sit. Lynwood Hall had been built to last forever. It was succeeding. The stone walls were solid. The roof was sound. The structure was fundamentally intact. But lasting and living are different things. The house was surviving, but it was not alive. Peter Widener's final walk through Lynwood Hall happened 3 days before his stroke. He made his usual circuit of the first-floor rooms, study to library, to gallery, to conservatory. He moved slowly, using his cane, stopping frequently to rest. The entire walk took over an hour. A housemaid watched from a service corridor. She later told other staff that Peter had stopped in each doorway, looking into the rooms as if seeing them for the first time. Or perhaps for the last time. He stood longest in the gallery, surrounded by paintings that had outlived his son and grandson, art that would outlive him, permanence achieved at the cost of everything that made permanence worthwhile. Then he returned to his study and did not leave it again until the stroke 3 days later. That was Peter Widener's final walk through the house he built to defeat death. The house that survived. The house that proved survival is not victory. The house that became a tomb before its builder died. The mansion that nobody wanted. Without its builder, Lynwood Hall became a problem too large to solve. Joseph Widener kept the estate for 14 years without living in it. He visited occasionally, walking through dust-covered rooms, checking for weather damage, approving minimal maintenance budgets. But Lynwood Hall was not his home. It was an inheritance he accepted out of family obligation, not desire. In 1936, Joseph died. His estate included his own substantial art collection, several properties, and Lynwood Hall. His heirs faced the same question Eleanor had confronted 20 years earlier. What do you do with a 110-room mansion built for a purpose that no longer exists? They tried to sell it. The Great Depression had devastated the market for luxury real estate. Mansions across America were being abandoned, converted, or demolished. Families who once employed 50 servants now struggled to keep houses heated. The idea of someone purchasing a 70,000 square foot private residence in 1936 was absurd. The property sat empty through the late 1930s. Caretakers were reduced to one part-time groundskeeper. Vandals broke several windows. Copper downspouts were stolen. The gardens, once maintained by 6 professionals, became overgrown meadows. Lynwood Hall was decaying not dramatically but incrementally through neglect and time. In 1942, the property was sold again. The buyer was the First Korean Church of New York. They purchased Lynwood Hall for $130,000, less than half what Joseph paid, and a fraction of its construction cost. The church planned to convert the mansion into a seminary and retreat center. The conversion began, but never completed. The costs were prohibitive. Heating a 70,000 square foot building designed for coal furnaces was impossible on a church budget. The layout was wrong for institutional use. Bedrooms could not easily become dormitories. The ballroom was too grand for a chapel. The gallery was useless for religious education. After 3 years of attempted renovation, the church abandoned the project. They sold Lynwood Hall in 1945 to another religious organization, which also failed to make the building functional. The mansion changed hands 4 more times over the next 30 years, each owner discovering the same truth. The house was too large, too expensive, too specifically designed to be successfully repurposed. By the 1970s, Lynwood Hall was genuinely abandoned. No owner, no caretakers, no maintenance. The roof began leaking. Water damage spread through third-floor rooms. Plaster ceilings collapsed. Windows shattered in storms. The marble staircase remained intact, but the bronze railings were stolen. The chandeliers were removed and sold. The pipe organ was gutted for parts. Vandals broke in regularly. They spray-painted walls, built fires in fireplaces that filled rooms with smoke, destroyed fixtures they could not steal. Lynwood Hall became a ruin, not through age but through abandonment. Local preservationists lobbied to have the house protected. They argued it was an important example of Gilded Age architecture, that Horace Trumbauer's design deserved preservation, that the historical significance warranted intervention. They submitted applications for historic landmark status. None succeeded. The building was privately owned. The owners were unreachable or uninterested. The cost of restoration was estimated at over $20 million, and no one was willing to fund it. Lynwood Hall was historically important, but economically impossible. In 1996, a developer purchased the property, planning to demolish the mansion and build condominiums on the land. Preservationists protested. The media covered the story. For a few months, Lynwood Hall was famous again, but this time as a symbol of lost grandeur rather than current wealth. The demolition permit was denied. The mansion was granted temporary protection while preservation options were explored. Those options went nowhere. The developer went bankrupt. The property entered legal limbo, owned by entities that existed only on paper, maintained by no one, visited only by trespassers and photographers documenting decay. By 2000, Lynwood Hall was a ghost house in every sense, physically present but functionally dead. The roof leaked in dozens of places. Mold covered interior walls. Trees grew through broken windows. Animals nested in the conservatory. The grand staircase remained structurally sound, but everything around it was collapsing. Photography blogs discovered the mansion. Urban explorers posted images of the destroyed ballroom, the graffiti-covered walls, the collapsed ceilings. The images went viral. Lynwood Hall became internet famous as an example of abandoned beauty, a real-life haunted mansion. The mythology intensified. Ghost hunting groups requested access. Paranormal investigators claimed the house was among the most haunted locations in America. Websites listed it alongside Eastern State Penitentiary and Gettysburg as a place where the dead refused to rest. But local teenagers still dared each other to enter after dark. They told stories about seeing figures in windows, hearing footsteps on the marble stairs, feeling cold hands touch them in empty rooms. The mansion's reputation as haunted was now more valuable than its reputation as architecture. In 2013, The property was purchased by a Philadelphia developer named Richard Yoon. He announced plans to restore Lynwood Hall and convert it into a private events venue. Restoration began. The roof was repaired. Windows were replaced. Water damage was assessed. But the work progressed slowly. The scale was overwhelming. Every repair revealed 10 more problems. Electrical systems needed complete replacement. Plumbing was unsalvageable. HVAC systems had to be designed from scratch for a building never meant to have central air conditioning. Costs escalated beyond projections. As of 2024, Lynwood Hall remains partially restored and fully inaccessible. The exterior looks maintained. The roof is intact. Windows are boarded rather than broken. But the interior is still gutted, still unfinished, still caught between ruin and restoration. The mansion has outlived its builder by over 100 years. It has outlasted the dynasty it was meant to preserve. It has survived longer than the fortunes that built it. Peter Widener wanted permanence. He got it. But permanence without purpose is just a structure that refuses to fall down. Lynwood Hall stands because stone is durable and foundations are deep, not because anyone needs it to stand, not because its existence serves any function beyond being evidence that it existed. The house Peter Widener built to defeat death has defeated everything. It has defeated utility, defeated beauty, defeated meaning. It stands empty, expensive, impossible, a problem too large for anyone to solve, and too significant for anyone to simply erase. That is Lynwood Hall's legacy, not wealth or art or family, just stubborn, meaningless, absolute survival. Echoes that refuse to leave. Visitors swear the house remembers what it was built to hold. The reports have remained consistent for over a century. Footsteps on the grand staircase when no one is there. Doors opening without cause. Cold spots in specific rooms despite no drafts. The sound of someone playing the piano in the music room years after the instrument was removed. Figures glimpsed in peripheral vision that vanish when looked at directly. Its security guards hired to watch the property overnight during the 2000-era restorations refused to work alone. Multiple guards quit after single shifts, citing experiences they could not explain rationally. One reported hearing his name called from empty rooms. Another saw a man in period clothing descending the main staircase, only to have the figure disappear halfway down. A construction crew working on roof repairs in 2014 reported finding a second-floor bedroom with furniture arranged as if still occupied. Bed made, curtains open, a book on the nightstand. But the room had been empty and locked for years. When the crew returned the next day, the furniture was covered in dust as if untouched for decades. Paranormal investigation teams have visited Lynwood Hall multiple times since the property became famous online. They bring electromagnetic field detectors, digital voice recorders, infrared cameras. They spend nights walking through empty rooms, asking questions into darkness, hoping for responses. They claim to receive them. Voices on recordings saying names. Temperature drops in specific locations, electromagnetic spikes near the gallery. One investigator reported feeling hands push him from behind while standing alone on the second-floor landing. He fell forward, bruised his shoulder, and refused to return. But every paranormal claim has a prosaic explanation if you choose to see it that way. Footsteps on the marble staircase could be thermal expansion. Stone and metal expand and contract with temperature changes, creating sounds that echo through large empty spaces. What sounds like footsteps might be the building itself shifting as it cools after sunset. Doors opening could be air pressure differences. A building with broken windows and gaps in the structure creates unpredictable air currents. A gust of wind entering one broken window can push a door open 3 rooms away. Add compromised weather sealing and doors that no longer sit square in their frames, and you have mechanical explanations for movement. Cold spots are predictable in a structure with damaged insulation and holes in the roof. Heat escapes unevenly. Some rooms retain warmth while others drop 20 degrees. Standing in a cold spot feels eerie, but indicates poor weatherproofing, not spirits. The sound of a piano could be auditory pareidolia. The human brain is designed to find patterns in noise. Wind moving through the building creates random sounds. A mind primed to expect piano music might interpret those sounds as notes, especially in a room where a piano once existed. Figures seen in peripheral vision are classic examples of the brain filling in incomplete visual data. Low light, movement from outside casting shadows, expectations of seeing something human shaped. The peripheral visual field is unreliable under ideal conditions. In an abandoned mansion at night, it becomes actively deceptive. The electromagnetic field spikes paranormal investigators love to cite measure environmental factors, not ghosts. Old wiring, even non-functional, can create residual fields. Metal structural elements conduct ambient electromagnetic radiation. Underground water can create measurable anomalies. Every spike has a mundane origin. And yet, the reports persist, not just from paranormal enthusiasts eager to believe, but from contractors, security personnel, and skeptics who entered the building expecting nothing and left unsettled. People with no investment in the house being haunted. People who did not want to believe what they experienced. A preservation architect working on structural assessments in 2015 described standing in the gallery alone, feeling certain someone was watching her. She turned multiple times, saw nothing, but could not shake the sensation. She described it as the building projecting presence, not threatening, but absolutely not empty. A photographer documenting the Decay for a coffee table book about abandoned mansions spent 2 days shooting interior spaces. On the second day, working in the conservatory, and he heard someone say his name clearly from the adjacent hallway. He was alone in the building. He checked every room, found no one. He finished the shoot, but later described the experience as the only time in 20 years of photographing abandoned properties that he felt genuinely afraid. The most compelling account comes from a night security guard in 2016. He was hired to watch the property during a legal dispute over ownership. His job was simple: walk the perimeter, check doors, report any intrusions. He had worked security for 15 years, jails, hospitals, warehouses. Nothing bothered him. On his third night at Lynwood Hall, he was walking the first floor around 2 in the morning. He heard footsteps above him on the second floor. Clear, deliberate, pacing. He assumed someone had broken in. He called police, then went upstairs to investigate. The second floor was empty, every room, every hallway, but as he stood at the top of the staircase, he heard the footsteps again. Below him now, on the first floor, where he had just been, he descended quickly. Nothing. Then he heard them on the second floor again, above him. He walked out of Lynwood Hall and waited in his car until police arrived. They searched the building thoroughly, found no one, no signs of entry, no explanation. The guard quit that night and refused to return even when offered double pay. He later told a reporter that he was not afraid of ghosts. He was afraid of what he could not categorize. The footsteps were real. He heard them clearly. But no person made them. That impossibility was more frightening than any supernatural explanation. Perhaps Lynwood Hall is haunted. Perhaps the grief that soaked into its walls during Peter Widener's final years left some residue. Perhaps the violence of a dynasty ending so abruptly imprinted something on the house. Perhaps George and Harry did come home in some form that buildings can hold, but humans cannot explain. Or perhaps Lynwood Hall is simply a very old, very damaged structure that generates sounds and shadows and sensations that human brains interpret through the lens of story. We need houses to mean something, especially houses this grand, especially houses with histories this tragic. A mansion built for a dynasty that died cannot be allowed to simply sit empty and meaningless. It must be haunted. It must contain echoes of the lives it was meant to preserve. Otherwise, it is just architecture slowly collapsing under its own weight. But whether the echoes are supernatural or psychological does not change their effect. Lynwood Hall unsettles people. It creates experiences that defy easy dismissal. It makes visitors feel watched, followed, remembered by something they cannot see. Maybe that is Peter Widener's final victory. He wanted the house to preserve memory, to make his name permanent, to ensure his dynasty could not be forgotten. The house has achieved that, not through grandeur or beauty or wealth, but through the way it makes people feel when they stand inside it. Lynwood Hall remembers. Whether memory is physics or spirit does not matter. The house holds something that will not let go, and everyone who enters can feel it. What Lynwood Hall teaches us: the mansion still stands, not as a triumph, but as a question carved in stone. Drive north from Philadelphia on Route 611. 12 miles outside the city, you will pass an estate surrounded by high walls and locked gates. If you look carefully through the trees, you can glimpse the limestone facade of Lynwood Hall. 110 rooms, 70,000 square feet, still standing, still empty, still waiting for a purpose it will never find. Peter Widener built the mansion to answer a question he was terrified to ask. What happens when I die? Will my name survive? Will anyone remember what I built? He believed permanence was the answer. Build something large enough, beautiful enough, expensive enough, and death would not matter. The house would remain. The dynasty would continue. Memory would be forced into stone. He was right about permanence. Lynwood Hall has survived 124 years. It outlasted Peter, outlasted his son and grandson, outlasted the Gilded Age, the Depression, 2 world wars, and every economic cycle since. The mansion is permanent in exactly the way Peter intended, but permanence proved nothing. The house stands empty. The dynasty ended. The art collection was scattered. The Widener name appears in history books primarily in connection with the Titanic disaster, not business achievement. Everything Peter built to ensure memory has instead become evidence that memory cannot be purchased. Lynwood Hall teaches us what happens when legacy becomes obsession, when the need to be remembered overpowers the need to live meaningfully in the present. Peter spent the last 3 years of his life trapped inside a monument to his own failure. He could not leave because leaving meant admitting the house no longer served its purpose. But staying meant living inside that admission daily. The mansion was built to contain generations. Instead, it contained one old man walking empty hallways, unable to find a reason to stop walking, unable to find a reason to keep going. That is the cost of building legacy machines. They survive you. They outlast your intentions. They become their own thing, separate from whatever meaning you tried to encode. And they trap everyone who believes permanence equals victory. Lynwood Hall also teaches us about scale. Peter believed bigger meant better. More rooms meant more security. More art meant more culture. More land meant more control. But scale does not create meaning. It amplifies it. If the meaning is hollow, a scale makes the hollowness unbearable. 110 rooms for 7 people. 35 acres of gardens no one walked. Art galleries no one visited. Every excess declared wealth, but it also declared absence. The house was always too large. Even at its peak, during parties with 50 guests, Lynwood Hall was mostly empty. It was designed that way, built to impress through excess rather than inhabit through need. And when the family contracted to just Peter, the scale became prison walls. Every empty room was a reminder of who should have been there. Every unused staircase was evidence of plans that failed. The mansion forced Peter to confront his dynasty's collapse every time he left his study. But perhaps the deepest lesson Lynwood Hall offers is about grief and its refusal to be contained. Peter tried to keep living as if George and Harry would return. He kept the house lit, kept the staff employed, kept the rooms ready. He would not sell the art or close wings or reduce operations because doing so meant accepting they were truly gone. Grief became architecture. His refusal to change the house was a refusal to accept loss. But grief does not work that way. It cannot be frozen. It cannot be kept at bay with money or stubbornness or empty rooms. Grief demands processing. When you refuse, it simply occupies more space until it is all that remains. Lynwood Hall is proof that you can build a fortress against death and die inside it anyway. You can construct permanence and watch it become a monument to impermanence. And you can force stone to outlast flesh and discover that survival without purpose is indistinguishable from failure. The mansion stands today as a question for anyone who sees it. What are you building? Are you creating something that serves life or something that replaces it? Are you investing in present connection or future memory? Are you making a home or a monument? Peter Widener chose monument. He believed legacy was the highest achievement, that being remembered mattered more than being present, that wealth could purchase immortality if deployed correctly. Lynwood Hall is his answer. 110 rooms that outlasted him and mean nothing. The house will likely survive another century. Stone endures. Foundations last. Buildings outlive their builders. Eventually, someone will find a use for it. Museum, hotel, event venue, something. The space will be repurposed. The rooms will be filled. Lynwood Hall will function again. But it will never again be what Peter Widener wanted it to be. A family home, a dynasty headquarters, a declaration that some lives are too important to forget. That dream died in the Atlantic on April 15th, 1912, along with George and Harry and the Vermeer that was supposed to complete the gallery. What remains is a building that proves survival is not victory. That permanence is not the same as mattering. That you can win every battle against time and still lose the only war that matters, which is the war to live meaningfully while you are alive. Lynwood Hall stands empty, silent, waiting for nothing. A palace that survived its purpose. A monument to a dynasty that never was. A question carved in stone that no one can answer. What happens when the house outlasts the home? When stone survives love? when permanence defeats the very life it was meant to preserve? Look at Lynwood Hall. You are looking at the answer,